On the morning of April 23, 2012, the farmers of Custer County, Nebraska woke up to the specific silence that follows a hailstorm that has done serious damage. The silence that is not peaceful but evaluative. The silence of men walking fields and equipment yards in the gray post-storm light, doing the kind of damage assessment that has no good version, only degrees of bad. And what the assessment revealed across the county that morning was not crop damage, the corn was not yet in the ground, and not structural damage, the hail had been large but the buildings it held, but equipment damage of a specific and deeply problematic kind, because the storm had arrived from the northwest at 2 in the morning with hailstones averaging 2 inches in diameter and had moved across the county in a diagonal path that covered approximately 340 square miles and had caught a significant portion of the county's farming equipment parked in the open, equipment that farmers had left outside in the mild April weather rather than sheltering in sheds, because 2 days ago the forecast had said light rain and nothing more, and the hydraulic lift housings on older John Deere machines, cast iron components that sat exposed on the left rear quarter of the tractor body in a position that the 2-inch hailstones had found with the accuracy of a problem that has been waiting for the right conditions to reveal itself, had cracked, not all of them and not identically, but enough of them and severely enough that by 8 in the morning the phones across Custer County were carrying a version of the same conversation, which was a farmer calling a neighbor and saying, "My hydraulic lift housing is cracked," and the neighbor saying, "Mine too," and both of them understanding without completing the sentence what a cracked hydraulic lift housing 14 days before planting season meant for a farmer whose entire operation depended on equipment that could not plant or cultivate or do anything else useful with a compromised hydraulic system, which was everything, which was the whole season, which was the year. By 9 in the morning, Dale Whitfield, who owned the authorized John Deere dealership in Broken Bow, had received 27 calls about cracked hydraulic lift housings, and by 10:30 the number was 41, and by noon it was 63, and Dale had stopped answering his own phone and had put his parts manager on the calls, because the answer to every call was the same answer, and Dale had delivered it enough times that the delivering had become something he needed distance from, which was that the hydraulic lift housing for the affected John Deere models, primarily the 40 series and 50 series machines that made up the backbone of Custer County's working equipment fleet, was not a stocked component at the Broken Bow dealership and was not a stocked component at any regional dealership within 200 miles, and was a part that John Deere's parts distribution system was showing as available for order with an estimated fulfillment timeline of 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks being a timeline that Dale understood and every farmer who heard it understood was not a solution to a problem occurring 14 days before planting season, but was instead a description of a different problem, which was that 6 to 8 weeks from April 23rd was the middle of June, and the middle of June in Custer County, Nebraska was not planting season anymore, but the season after planting season, and a farmer who missed planting season did not have a crop, and a farmer who did not have a crop did not have a year, and the mathematics of that outcome applied to 63 farmers and was still accumulating. Dale had called John Deere's regional parts distribution center in Omaha at 10 in the morning and had been told what he already knew, that the part was not available in regional inventory and that the 6 to 8 week estimate was accurate and that he could place orders for his customers and the parts would arrive when they arrived. And Dale had said, "These farmers have 14 days before they need to be in the ground." And the parts distribution representative had said, "I understand that's difficult, Mr. Whitfield, but I can't manufacture inventory that doesn't exist." And Dale had said, "Is there any expedited option?" And the representative had said, "Expedited shipping on a back-ordered part doesn't change the manufacturing timeline, Mr. Whitfield. It only changes the shipping time once the part is available." And Dale had put the phone down and sat in his office and looked at the wall for a while, because the wall was not going to tell him anything useful, but looking at it was preferable to continuing a conversation that had no good direction. What nobody at John Deere's regional parts distribution center in Omaha knew, what Dale Whitfield himself did not know despite having operated the authorized dealership in Broken Bow for 19 years, was that 4 miles outside of Merna on a gravel road that required knowing it was there before you could find it, there was a metal shed attached to a modest farmhouse where a 74-year-old man named Walter Cruz had been doing something for 15 years that John Deere's entire parts distribution infrastructure could not do on April 23, 2012, which was machine replacement hydraulic housings for 40 series and 50 series John Deere tractors from raw cast iron stock on a 1967 South Bend lathe and a Bridgeport milling machine that Walter had bought used in 1987 and had maintained with the same patient thoroughness he applied to everything in his life. And Walter had been doing this not because he had anticipated a hailstorm in April of 2012, but because he had understood something about the trajectory of the parts manufacturing industry that the farmers who would need him on April 23rd had not thought about, and that the authorized dealer who would eventually call him had spent years arguing against, which was that the parts for older equipment do not get manufactured forever, that the day comes when a company decides the production run is no longer economically justified and discontinues the component, and that on the day after that decision, the farmer with the older machine has two options: find someone who can make the part or park the machine. And Walter Cruz had spent 15 years making sure that in Custer County, Nebraska, the first option was available, quietly, without announcement, without the kind of visibility that invites the attention of people who prefer that the first option not exist, machining components in his shed, on his lathe and his mill, and stacking them on shelves along the back wall with the patient accumulation of a man building something that will matter most on a day he cannot predict but is completely certain will arrive. Walter Cruz had not always been the man on the gravel road outside Merna that nobody thought about until they needed him, had not always been the quiet presence at the edge of the county's awareness that farmers mentioned occasionally in the context of older equipment problems, and that the authorized dealer in Broken Bow mentioned not at all because mentioning him was counterproductive to the business model that the authorized dealer existed to serve. And to understand what Walter had built in his shed over 15 years, you had to understand what Walter had been before the shed, which was a John Deere factory-trained mechanic who had worked for Dale Whitfield's predecessor at the Broken Bow dealership for 11 years between 1971 and 1982, and who had during those 11 years developed a knowledge of John Deere's mechanical systems that his colleagues and his supervisors had recognized as something beyond ordinary competence. Not just the ability to diagnose and repair, but the deeper understanding of why the systems were designed the way they were designed, and how the components related to each other at the level of engineering intention rather than just service manual instruction. The kind of understanding that cannot be produced by reading and cannot be fully transmitted by training, but develops in a man who has an innate feel for mechanical systems and who spends 11 years with his hands inside the same family of machines until the machines become familiar in the way that a language becomes familiar, not just comprehensible but intuitive. He had left the dealership in 1982 not because of any conflict or failure, but because his father had died and left him the farm outside Merna, and Walter had decided that farming is what he wanted to do with the second half of his life, and he had farmed it well for 30 years. 280 acres of corn and soybeans worked with the same methodical attention he had applied to everything, and the mechanic's knowledge had come with him from the dealership and had never stopped being useful, because a farmer who can repair his own equipment has a cost structure and an independence that a farmer who depends entirely on authorized service cannot match. And Walter had kept his tools and kept his skills current and kept his South Bend lathe and his Bridgeport mill in the shed behind the farmhouse, because a machinist who sells his machines sells his capability, and Walter had never been interested in selling his capability. The decision to begin machining replacement components had arrived not as a plan, but as a response to a specific problem occurring in the winter of 1997 when a neighbor named Frank Dillard had come to Walter with a cracked hydraulic component on his aging John Deere 4040 and had already called the Broken Bow dealership and been told the part was discontinued and no longer available through John Deere's parts system. And Frank had asked Walter if there was anything to be done, and Walter had looked at the cracked component and looked at his lathe and looked at the raw cast iron stock he kept on hand for general repair work and had said, "Give me 2 days." And 2 days later, Frank Dillard had a machined replacement component that Walter had produced from raw stock on his South Bend lathe and that fit the 4040's hydraulic system with a precision that Walter's 11 years of factory-trained knowledge had made possible. And Frank had offered to pay, and Walter had said, "Bring me a bushel of sweet corn in August." And Frank had laughed and done exactly that. And Walter had filed the experience in the part of his mind that processed information about what the future was likely to require, filed it alongside the trajectory of John Deere's parts manufacturing decisions that he had been observing since leaving the dealership in 1982, the steady and economically rational process by which older component lines were discontinued as the machines they served aged out of the primary fleet.
And Walter had understood from Frank Dillard's cracked hydraulic component in 1997 that the discontinuation process was accelerating, that the 40 series and 50 series machines that formed the working core of Custer County's equipment fleet were entering the window where their components would begin disappearing from the parts catalog one by one, and that the farmers who depended on those machines were going to need someone who could make what the catalog no longer offered. And Walter had gone to his shed and begun machining components not for any immediate need, but for the need he could see coming, the way he had always been able to see mechanical failure coming, by understanding the system well enough to know where the stress was accumulating before the crack appeared. By 2012, the shelves along the back wall of Walter's shed held components for 14 different John Deere systems across the 40 and 50 series platform, each component machined to the original factory specifications that Walter had memorized during 11 years at the Broken Bow dealership and had verified against the original engineering drawings that he had obtained through channels that reflected the resourcefulness of a man who understands that the information required to do something correctly is worth whatever effort its acquisition demands. And the hydraulic lift housing was among the components on those shelves, had been among them since 2003, when Walter had first machined a replacement for a farmer named Curtis Banks, whose 4250 had developed a stress crack in the original casting. And Walter had machined that first housing and then machined 6 more because the casting geometry was complex and the setup time on the Bridgeport was substantial, and once the setup was done, the marginal cost of additional units was low. And Walter's instinct had said, make more than you need today, because today is not the day you are making them for. And by April 23, 2012, there were 11 machined hydraulic housings on the back wall shelf, 11 components that fit the affected John Deere models with factory precision, and that had been sitting on that shelf, waiting with the patient readiness of things made by a man who understood that preparation and timing are the same virtue expressed at different moments. Preparation being what you do when the need is not yet visible, and timing being what you do when the need arrives and the preparation is already complete. Walter heard about the hailstorm damage the same way he heard about most things, through his neighbor Pete Aldrich, who called at 8:30 in the morning on April 23rd and said, "Walter, you hear about the hydraulic housings?" And Walter said, "I heard the storm. I figured there'd be housings." And Pete said, "Dale Whitfield's phone is ringing off the wall. 6 to 8 weeks on the part." And Walter said, "I know." And Pete said, "You've got them, don't you?" And Walter said, "I've got 11. And Pete was quiet for a moment and then said, "There's going to be more than 11 farmers who need them." And Walter said, "I know that too." And Pete said, "What are you going to do?" And Walter said, "Same thing I always do." And Pete said, "Which is what?" And Walter said, "The work that needs doing," and hung up and went to his shed and opened the doors and looked at the 11 housings on the back wall shelf, and then looked at his lathe and his mill and calculated in his head the time required to machine additional units from the raw stock he had on hand, and arrived at a number that was large, but not impossible for a man who had been doing this work for 15 years, and who understood that the 14 bays before planting season was not a deadline that the county could negotiate with, and was therefore not a deadline he could negotiate with either.
The first farmer arrived at Walter's shed at 9:45 on the morning of April 23rd, not because Walter had announced anything or made any calls, but because Pete Aldrich had mentioned to his neighbor Gene Foskett, after hanging up with Walter, that Walter Cruz had 11 housings on his shelf, and Gene had told his brother-in-law Dave Paulson, who needed a housing for his 4450, and Dave had driven directly to the gravel road outside Merna without calling ahead, because in Custer County, Nebraska, you did not call ahead when the situation was urgent, and the man you were going to see was the kind of man who did not require advance notice to be ready. And Dave had pulled into Walter's yard and found Walter already in the shed, with the doors open and the lathe running its warm-up cycle, and a hydraulic lift housing sitting on the workbench beside the Bridgeport mill. And Dave had said, "Pete Aldrich said you might have what I need." And Walter had said, "What model?" And Dave had said, 4450. And Walter had walked to the back wall and taken a housing from the shelf and brought it to the workbench and said, "This'll fit your 4450. And Dave had looked at it and turned it in his hands with the careful attention of a farmer evaluating a component he's about to trust his planting season to. And then he looked at Walter and said, "You machined this yourself." And Walter had said, "On the South Bend." And Dave had said, "When?"
And Walter had said 2009. And Dave had said, "It's been sitting here since 2009? And Walter had said, "I machine them when the setup is right and store them until they're needed." And Dave had looked at the housing and looked at the lathe and looked at Walter and said, "What do I owe you?" And Walter had named a price that was fair in the way that prices are fair when the person setting them has no interest in extracting maximum value from a situation of scarcity, but is instead interested in covering his material costs and his time and leaving the farmer in a position to plant his crop and continue farming, which was the outcome Walter cared about rather than the margin the situation would have supported if he had been a different kind of man. By noon, 7 farmers had come to the gravel road outside Merna, and 7 housings had left the back wall shelf, and Walter had installed 4 of them himself, because the farmers who needed the fastest return to operational status had asked if he could do the installation, and Walter had said yes, because saying no to work that needed doing was not something his nature permitted. And the shed had the focused, purposeful atmosphere of a place where serious work is being conducted by a man who knows exactly what he is doing and has everything required to do it within arm's reach. The South Bend lathe running between installations, producing additional housings from the raw cast iron stock that Walter had been accumulating for exactly this kind of demand. The Bridgeport mill finishing the bearing surfaces and the mounting faces to the tolerances that the John Deere engineering specifications required. Walter moving between the machines and the workbench and the farmers' tractors parked in the yard with the unhurried efficiency of a man for whom the work and the tools and the physical space have been integrated over decades into a single functioning system that does not require thought to operate, but only attention. And the attention Walter gave it was complete and steady and entirely characteristic of a man who had been doing this work since before most of the farmers currently parking in his yard had been old enough to drive the machines they were bringing him.
Dale Whitfield heard about Walter Cruz at 2 in the afternoon on April 23rd. Not from a farmer, and not from any official channel, but from his own parts manager, Randy Souza, who had grown up in Custer County and who came into Dale's office and said, "Dale, I need to tell you something." And Dale said, "What?" And Randy said, "Walter Cruz, out on the gravel road past Merna, has machined hydraulic lift housings for the affected models. He's got them on a shelf in his shed." And Dale looked at Randy and said, "Walter Cruz, the independent mechanic?" And Randy said yes. And Dale was quiet for a moment, with the specific quality of quiet that a man produces when he is receiving information that conflicts with a position he has held publicly and consistently for a long time, because Dale Whitfield had spent the better part of a decade telling farmers that independent mechanics working outside the authorized service network were not equipped to handle the complexity of modern John Deere systems, had said this at Farm Bureau meetings and in the dealership's newsletter and in individual conversations with farmers who mentioned Walter Cruz as an alternative to the dealership's service rates. And the information Randy Souza was now delivering was that the man Dale had spent a decade characterizing as inadequate was currently the only person in Custer County who could solve the problem that Dale's own authorized network had told 63 farmers would take 6 to 8 weeks to address. And Dale sat with that information for a while and then said, "How many housings does he have?" And Randy said, "He started with 11 and he's been machining more since this morning. Pete Aldridge says he's been running the lathe all day." And Dale said, "Are they good?" And Randy said, "Dave Paulson installed one this morning and said it fit better than the original." And Dale looked at his desk, and then at the wall, and then at the window that looked out onto the Highway 2 dealership lot where 3 farmers were standing beside their trucks having arrived to ask about the housing and having received the 6 to 8 week answer and having not yet left because leaving meant accepting an answer that their planting calendars could not accommodate. And Dale said, "I need to go out there and talk to those farmers." And Randy said, "What are you going to tell them?" And Dale said, "I'm going to tell them about Walter Cruz." And Randy said, "You sure about that?" And Dale looked at the 3 farmers through the window and then looked at Randy and said, "Randy, I've got 63 farmers who need a part I can't supply and a man 4 miles outside Merna who can supply it. What exactly would you like me to be sure about?" And Randy had no answer for that, because the answer was obvious, and the obviousness of it was the most uncomfortable part of the afternoon, more uncomfortable than the 6 to 8 week timeline, and more uncomfortable than the 63 unanswered calls, and more uncomfortable than anything else that April 23rd had produced, which was the simple and unambiguous demonstration that the knowledge Dale had spent 10 years telling farmers they no longer needed was the only knowledge that mattered today. Dale Whitfield drove out to the gravel road outside Merna at 4:30 in the afternoon on April 23rd, not in his personal truck, but in the dealership's service vehicle, because arriving in the dealership vehicle felt more honest about what the visit was, felt like the appropriate acknowledgement that this was not a personal call, but a professional one, a business coming to a man it had spent 10 years dismissing because the business needed something the man had and the business did not. And Dale had thought about this on the 40-minute drive from Broken Bow, had thought about the Farm Bureau meetings and the newsletter language and the individual conversations with farmers where he had characterized independent mechanics as inadequate and unqualified, had thought about the specific conversations where Walter Cruz had been mentioned by name, and Dale had responded with the carefully worded institutional skepticism that the dealership's relationship with John Deere's authorized service network required him to maintain. And Dale had arrived at no comfortable resolution of the distance between those conversations and the conversation he was now driving toward, had arrived only at the practical conclusion that the distance existed and that crossing it was necessary, and that the manner of the crossing was the one thing he still had some control over. And he had decided that the manner would be direct and without qualification, because Walter Cruz was not a man who would respond well to the kind of language that tries to minimize what it is acknowledging. And Dale had known Walter long enough, had worked alongside him at the old dealership for 2 years before Walter left in 1982, to understand what directness meant to him and what its absence would communicate. Walter was at the lathe when Dale pulled into the yard, visible through the open shed doors in the late afternoon light, standing at the south bend with safety glasses on and cast iron chips accumulating on the floor around his feet. And there were 4 tractors parked in the yard in various stages of repair, 2 with their hydraulic housings already replaced and 2 waiting, and a farmer named Bill Crenshaw was sitting on an upturned bucket near the shed door, drinking coffee from a thermos and watching Walter work with the patient appreciation of a man watching someone do something well. And Bill looked up when Dale's service vehicle pulled in and said nothing, but his expression communicated something that Dale received clearly, which was that the situation in this yard was the situation, and the situation in Broken Bow was the situation, and both of them knew what the difference between the two situations meant. Dale got out of the service vehicle and walked to the shed door and stood there for a moment watching Walter work, and Walter finished the pass he was making on the lathe and stepped back and looked at the component and then looked at Dale over his safety glasses and said, "Dale." And Dale said, "Walter," and they looked at each other across the 30 years since Walter had left the dealership and across the 10 years of newsletter language and Farm Bureau meetings and the 63 farmers whose morning had been shaped by the distance between what the authorized network could provide and what the shed on the gravel road outside Merna had been quietly building since 1997. And Dale said, "I owe you an apology before I say anything else." And Walter took his safety glasses off and set them on the lathe and said, "All right?" And Dale said, "I've spent the better part of 10 years telling farmers that independent mechanics weren't equipped to handle John Deere systems, and I said some of that in specific reference to you, and I was wrong to say it, and I was wrong to keep saying it, and today makes that clearer than anything I could have said myself." And Walter looked at him for a moment and then said, "I appreciate that, Dale." And the appreciation was genuine, and the acknowledgement was complete, and neither man felt the need to extend the conversation beyond what it had accomplished, because both of them had been raised in the tradition that says what needs to be said gets said, and then the work continues, and the work was what mattered now.
Dale asked Walter how many housings he could produce before planting season, and Walter said, "How many do you need?" And Dale said, "I've got 63 confirmed, and the number is still growing." And Walter said, "I've got raw stock for 22 more units, and I can have them machined in 8 days if I run the lathe 10 hours a day." And Dale said, "That's 33 total with what you had on the shelf." And Walter said, 33. And Dale said, "I've got a farmer in Broken Bow with a metal supplier contact in Grand Island who might be able to truck cast iron stock down here inside 48 hours. Would additional stock change your output?" and Walter looked at his lathe and his mill and calculated the way he always calculated, carefully and from the actual constraints rather than the desired outcome, and said, if I had stock for another 40 units, I could have them done before planting. I'd need to run 12-hour days, and I'd need someone who can do finish work on the Bridgeport while I'm running the lathe. And Dale said, I've got a machinist at the dealership, young guy named Andy Reese, 2 years out of trade school. He's good with the mill. Would you be willing to let him work alongside you? And Walter said, can he hold 1,000th? And Dale said, yes. And Walter said, send him tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. And Dale nodded and then said, Walter, what are you charging for the housings? And Walter named the same price he had been charging all day. And Dale looked at the number and said, that's below what I'd have to charge through the dealership. And Walter said, I know. And Dale said, you could charge more, the market would support it. And Walter looked at him with the expression of a man who has considered this and reached a conclusion that does not require defending, but that he will state clearly because clarity is a form of respect, and Dale had just shown him respect and deserved clarity in return. And Walter said, Dale, these are my neighbors. I've been their mechanic for 30 years, and I'll be their mechanic for whatever years I've got left. I'm not going to use a hailstorm to change what I charge my neighbors. And Dale said nothing for a moment, and then said, I should have been saying things like that in my newsletter instead of what I was saying. And Walter said, probably. And Dale said, I'll have Andy here at 6. And Walter said, tell him to bring his own coffee. I don't make enough for company. And Dale almost smiled for the first time since 9 in the morning when the 27th call about a cracked housing had come into the dealership, and the day had stopped being manageable and started being something that required a different kind of management than Dale's authorized network had been designed to provide. Andy Reese arrived at Walter's shed at 5:58 on the morning of April 24th, 2 minutes before 6, which Walter noted without comment, but which registered as a positive indicator of the kind of man he was dealing with, because a young machinist who arrives 2 minutes early to his 6 o'clock start in a shed on a gravel road outside Merna on the morning after his boss called to say, report to an independent mechanic and do what he tells you, is a young machinist who understands that the work matters more than the circumstance of the work. And Walter handed Andy a technical drawing of the hydraulic lift housing and a set of calipers, and pointed to the Bridgeport mill and said, I need the bearing surfaces finished to this tolerance and the mounting faces square to within 0.5 Can you do that? And Andy studied the drawing for a minute and measured the partially machined component on the workbench and looked at the Bridgeport and said, yes. And Walter said, show me.
And Andy set up the Bridgeport and made the first finishing pass on the component, and Walter measured the result with his own calipers and looked at the number and said, good, do the rest the same way, and went to his South Bend lathe and started the day's production run. And the shed settled into the rhythm of 2 machinists working in the same space with the focused efficiency that skilled people produce when they are doing work they understand with tools they trust toward an outcome they both recognize as necessary. And that rhythm sustained itself through 12 hours on April 24th and 12 hours on April 25th, and the days that followed with the steady accumulation of completed components that the back wall shelf received and that farmers came to collect with the specific gratitude of people whose planting season has been returned to them by something they had not expected to exist. The cast iron stock arrived from Grand Island on the afternoon of April 24th, trucked down by a supplier named Patterson Materials, who had been reached by the Broken Bow farmer Dale had mentioned, and who had loaded his truck the same morning the call came because the situation had been explained to him clearly, and because a man in the materials supply business understands instinctively what a planting season deadline means to a farmer, and what it means to be the person who either helps or doesn't help when the deadline is real and the margin is gone. And Walter had looked at the stock when it arrived and calculated what it represented in finished housings and had said to Andy, we can do this, and Andy had said, I know we can. And that was the extent of the motivational conversation, because both of them were already motivated by the work itself, and the work was sufficient. By May 3rd, 11 days after the hailstorm, Walter and Andy had produced 61 additional housings beyond the 11 Walter had on the shelf when the storm hit, 72 total, and the number of farmers in Custer County whose equipment was operational for planting had grown from 0 on the morning of April 23rd to 112 by the first week of May, 112 machines that had been idle and were now running because a 74-year-old man on a gravel road outside Merna had spent 15 years building
building the capability that the authorized network had spent 10 years telling farmers they no longer needed, and the planting season that had appeared on April 23rd to be lost was instead conducted on schedule across most of the county, with a delay of less than 2 weeks that the favorable May weather absorbed without significant yield consequence, and the harvest that fall came in at yields that the spring's crisis had given no one reason to expect, and that the summer's growing conditions had quietly made possible, while the memory of the hailstorm and the idle machines and the gravel road outside Merna was still recent enough to carry its full weight. Dale Whitfield drove out to Walter's shed on the first Saturday in June after the planting was done and the immediate crisis had resolved itself into the ordinary progress of a farming season, and he brought Andy Reese with him, and they sat in Walter's yard on upturned buckets the way men sit when the work is finished and the sitting is itself a kind of acknowledgement. And Dale said, "I want to talk about what comes next." And Walter said, "What do you mean?" And Dale said, "I mean that what happened here in the last 2 weeks demonstrated something that I think we both understand and that I'd like to find a way to formalize." And Walter said, "Formalize how?" And Dale said, "I want to establish a parts machining arrangement, an official relationship between the dealership and your shed, where you produce components for discontinued lines and we stock them and distribute them to farmers who need them." And Walter looked at Dale and said, "You'd put your dealership's name on components machined in my shed?" And Dale said, "I'd put my dealership's name on components machined by the best John Deere mechanic in Custer County who happens to work in a shed on a gravel road instead of a dealership building." And Walter was quiet for a moment and then said, "John Deere's authorized network won't like that arrangement." And Dale said, "John Deere's authorized network couldn't supply 63 farmers in a 14-day window and you supplied 112. I think the authorized network's preferences are going to have to accommodate that reality." And Walter looked at his shed and his lathe and his Bridgeport and the empty shelf on the back wall that had held 11 housings on the morning of April 23rd, and that he was already planning to refill with the components his 15 years of observation told him the county would need next, and he said, "I'll think about it," which was Walter's way of saying yes when the yes required the dignity of appearing to have been considered rather than given immediately. And Dale understood this and said, "Take your time." And Andy said, "Mr. Cruz, can I ask you something?" And Walter said, "Go ahead." And Andy said, "How did you know which components to machine? I mean, before any of this happened, how did you know what the county would need?" And Walter looked at the young machinist who had worked 12-hour days beside him for 11 days and held his tolerances and asked good questions and deserved a real answer. And he said, "I paid attention to what the company was discontinuing, and I paid attention to what the farmers were running, and I paid attention to where those two things were going to intersect." And Andy said, "And then you just made the parts." And Walter said, "And then I made the parts." And Andy said, "For 15 years, just in case?" And Walter said, "The just in case is the whole job, son. The repair is easy once you have the part. The hard part is having the part before anyone knows they need it." And Andy nodded and looked at the shed and the tools and the empty shelf and understood that what he was looking at was not just a machinist's shed, but a philosophy. The philosophy of a man who had paid attention long enough and carefully enough to see what was coming before it arrived and had done the quiet, unglamorous work of preparation while the authorized network was telling farmers that preparation of this kind was obsolete and unnecessary and not covered under warranty. And the hailstorm had not created Walter Cruz or his value or the 15 years of components on his shelf, had only made visible what had always been there, the way a drought makes visible the depth of roots that the rain had always concealed.